Hi, my name is Lillian Rodriguez, and today I will be conducting a presentation on the story written by Susan Glaspel titled Trifles. Trifles is a story written in the 1900s, and it consists of a married couple, Mrs. Minnie Wright and Mr. John Wright, who have been married for numerous years, live on a farm, do not have any children, and basically have consumed themselves with their lifestyle of farming. They do not have any friends that visit or family members, as well as they don't go anywhere. They do not leave their home to visit outside friends or relatives. They've pretty much consumed themselves with the farm lifestyle, and as such, has become their way of life. The plot of the story becomes when one day Mr. Wright is found murdered, and the only other person in the household when the murder was committed is Miss Minnie Wright. So the question becomes, who committed the murder? Upon finding Mr. Wright murdered in his own home, this leads to an investigation to find out who committed the murder. There are four individuals who come back to the home to visit and look for clues and evidence to identify whom the murder was. Those four individuals are Mrs. Hart, Mrs. Peters, the county attorney, and Hale, the gentleman who actually discovered the body. As we'll look through the slides and presentation, you'll see there's a variety of clues and evidence found by Mrs. Hart and Mrs. Peters that lead us to believe Minnie is responsible for killing her husband. If indeed Minnie killed her husband, were the acts of murder justifiable and inevitable in this case? Let's find out. The first clue that we need to look at is Minnie's life with her husband, Mr. John Wright. They, as I mentioned earlier, they were farmers back in the 1930s, where, unlike other individuals, were pretty much to themselves. Minnie's behavior was she was detached and isolated from the outside world. She pretty much didn't interact with other individuals. She did not belong to any type of ladies club or any of such nature. She just spent her life living in her home alone. Mr. Wright was abusive to Minnie. In this story or play, it says that Mr. Wright did not treat Minnie very well. He was actually mean to her, possibly even physically abused her, definitely emotionally. So obviously there were some negative vibes between Mr. and Mrs. Wright as they lived together. Minnie was lonely. As I mentioned, she lived a detached and isolated life. So she did not have any day-to-day interactions with other individuals. The only interactions she did have was with Mr. Wright, who, once again, abused her. So imagine a lifestyle of day in, day out, only discussing, talking, interacting with your husband, who at times emotionally and possibly physically abused you. Therefore, Minnie was a prisoner in her own home. She wasn't given the opportunity to join ladies clubs or do other things with, that time in the 1930s where women got together and possibly quilted together or took care of their children together. Not that Minnie had children, but gave her an opportunity to basically interact with other individuals. Minnie was not allowed that opportunity. Was given a bit of history of Mr. and Mrs. Wright's lifestyle and actually investigating who committed John Wright's murder, then that takes us to some of the clues that were identified in the story of Trifles that lead us to believe that Minnie was the one that actually committed the murder. Those clues are as follows. First of all, Minnie did not report her husband's murder. The kitchen was found out of order, which back in the 1930s, kitchen and the rest of the home were always in order. The quilt stitches that Minnie were working on were in an unusual disarray. A dead canary is found in a box hidden amongst Minnie's stitching items. The first clue that leads us to believe Minnie was responsible for her husband's murder is she did not report the murder. The body is found by Hale, who is a gentleman which stops by the Wright home to visit with John Wright. When he does, he finds Minnie rocking on her chair. She seems unfocused and in a frenzied state of mind, almost mentally unstable. He proceeds to ask Minnie, where is John Wright? He would like to see him. Minnie answers basically, no, you cannot see John. When Hale asks why, Minnie responds, because he's dead. Now, of course, this doesn't seem like a normal person's response or behavior. Obviously, had there been an intruder that had come in the home and murdered her husband, then she would have obviously reported the murder to someone, even though she didn't interact with her neighbors or had family or friends. I'm sure she would have ran out and find a way to speak with someone and let them know she had found her husband murdered. Of course, during the investigation, Minnie is asked, well, didn't you hear something? Didn't you see something? Minnie admits to sleeping in the bed with Mr. Wright, but quote unquote, she doesn't know how it happened because she didn't wake up. She's a sound sleeper. Now, it's pretty obvious that two people sleeping in the bed together, one person is murdered. The other, of course, would have heard something, felt something, seen something. So it's almost not reasonable to believe that she was such a sound sleeper she didn't hear an intruder in the home. The next clue that leads me to believe Minnie may have committed the murder is the kitchen's found out of order. The kitchen in the now abandoned farmhouse of John Wright, a gloomy kitchen, and left without having been put in order. Unwashed pans under the sink, a loaf of bread outside the bread box, a dish towel on the table, other signs of incomplete work. As I mentioned earlier, this story takes place in the early 1900s, and actually in that era, the women stayed home and took care of the home inside as the husbands worked. And in this case, Mr. Wright was a farmer. Finding the home in such a disarray was just unusual. As Mrs. Hart and Mrs. Peters continued to discuss the way they found the home, and discuss Minnie Wright further, they discovered the quilt pieces Minnie was working on. As you see here in the quote, it says, here, this is the one she was working on, and look at the sewing. All the rest of it has been so nice and even. And look at this. It's all over the place. Why? It looks as if she didn't know what she was about. What this leads me to believe is that at some point Minnie either became nervous, unfocused, and at such a time lost her pattern or began stitching in a not correct way, as the quote states. As Miss Hale and Miss Peters continue to look around the home, Miss Peters discovers a bird cage in a cupboard. She asks Miss Hale if she recalls the Wrights owning a bird. And unfortunately, Miss Hale is unable to answer that question, since she admits that she did not have enough time to visit the Wrights. After all, Mr. Wright did not like visitors. They continue to speak, and at some point get curious and look under the quilted items. They find a box that it looks very nice and catches their eye. As they look in the box, open it up and look inside, there they find a dead bird, which catches their breath, and at this point can start seeing the connection and assume that this bird belonged to Mrs. Wright. The bird has been strangled, same way that Mr. Wright was found dead. So as you start to connect the dots, it's more apparent to see that the murderer in this film or story is leaning towards Miss Minnie Wright. As I mentioned, John was found strangled, similar to the canary that was found in the box. Coincidence that both individuals, the canary and John, were strangled? Interesting enough, the murder weapon of choice was a noose. I think this is another clue to indicate that indeed Minnie is responsible for her husband's murder. At this point, it's clear to see, based on the evidence and the clues found by Mrs. Hart and Mrs. Peters, that Minnie is responsible for her husband's murder. But why do they not come forward with the clues and let the county attorney and Hale know what they found? In my opinion, it's because in Mrs. Hart and Mrs. Peters' own mind, they would like to justify Minnie's murder. Well, after all, she has been living with John Wright for many, many years. And throughout the course of her years with Mr. Wright, Minnie changed. When she was Minnie Foster, she actually used to sing. She was involved in other activities with other individuals, and she was pretty and she dressed nice. That was then. As Minnie Wright, 30 years later, she is lonely, isolated, abused. It seems the only thing Minnie had at this point that kept her sane was the canary. After all, she liked to sing when she was young, so why would she not like a canary bird? Listening to a canary sing, it seemed that was the only thing that kept Minnie going. It appears that John Wright murdered Minnie's canary. And as a result, Minnie became hostile, in a rage of anger, in a range of disgust, in a range of disgust. Minnie decided she was going to strangle John. Is it right? Is it justifiable? I dare say yes. Simply because, although I do not condone murder, again, this story takes place in 1930, where women's words were not heard. Women did not have rights. Women were meant to stay at home and live by way of their husband's rules, whether right or wrong. I think Minnie felt trapped. Minnie felt like she had no one to turn to, and Minnie took basically her canary's death into her own hands, and she murdered her husband just like he murdered her canary. I think that Mrs. Hart and Mrs. Peters saw the evidence that we went over today, or I went over today in this presentation, and felt that possibly they could have helped Minnie had they come over and visited. Even though John didn't like people to come over, they could have did a little bit more, and possibly Minnie wouldn't have gotten to this state of mind. So, based on the evidence and the clues that have been found, I feel that Minnie's committing the murder was justifiable.